Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So this is the fourth part of our weekly teaching series, which has been collectively entitled Thinking and Organising Beyond the Pandemic, a Relational Poverty Toolkit. So if you've tuned in for the last 3 weeks of this, you will have seen my good friend and colleague, David Giles, in the MC role. David, hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So this is the fourth part of our weekly to the chair role. So it's really great to be with you for this this final episode in our series. So each of these sessions has aimed to bring scholars, advocates, organisers and frontline providers together from different social spheres and different parts of the globe to try to grasp exactly what sort of new world we are emerging into in this time of pandemic, what baggage we are inheriting from the old one and what radical new possibilities we need to organise for. And so today we are meeting to think and talk and scheme together on the theme of borders, immobilities and pandemic nations. So I want to begin, first of all, by acknowledging the various places and contexts from within which we are coming together. So my name is Victoria Stead. For me, I'm speaking to you from the south of Melbourne in Australia, on the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people. And in all settler colonial places where people are gathered today, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous lands on which we are meeting, speaking, living. I want to acknowledge as well that we are coming together at a time where waves of protest and uprising are spreading across the United States, across other places as well, demanding, calling for the value of Black and Brown lives, standing up in the faces of phenomenal structures of racialised power and oppression. In Australia here as well, this weekend, people will be organising around the demands of Black Lives Matter and also Aboriginal Lives Matter in recognition of many hundreds of Indigenous deaths in custody in this place as well. And what these contexts do, of course, is draw our attention to very deep, pervasive structures of power and oppression and resistance to these. And while I think so many people like me, people who are white, who are non-Indigenous, experience this present moment of pandemic as a crisis that is a sharp, acute rupture, a shock to the system of privilege, I want to acknowledge the very long and enduring crises of colonialism and racial oppression that First Nations and people of colour have for so long contended with. Crises, threats to lives and well-being are for so many people not new or novel states of experience. So I'd like to thank Verso Books and the Relational Poverty Network for jointly hosting these teachings. Verso is, of course, the largest independent radical publishing house in the Anglophone world, and the Relational Poverty Network is a global community that aims to bring together researchers, teachers, advocates, activists and policymakers across a spectrum of social and spatial differences in exactly the way that we have tried to do in this teaching series. The RPN aims to challenge the traditional ways in which poverty has often been conceived as a discrete phenomena to be studied, regulated, disincentivized, stigmatized, and so on. Instead, the Relational Poverty Network aims to identify the ways in which poverty is produced multiply by interlocking systems, from the racism of the carceral state to the violently gendered division of essential labour, from the structural violence of the housing market to the neoliberal austerity of our safety nets, and so on. These systems simultaneously generate privilege and deprivation, power and vulnerability, wealth and exploitation. So I'd also like to thank our speakers for today. Manoj Dias-Abi, a lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. Sanmati Verma, a lawyer and organiser from the United Workers Union and Undocumented Migrant Solidarity. I'll speak a little bit. My name's Victoria, as I mentioned. I'm from Deakin University in Australia. Also Teresa Mayers, an anthropologist at the University of Vermont. Marumora Villalpando, an undocumented migrant fighting detention in the United States and the founder of Latino Advocacy. And Ruja Meedi, a Kurdish Australian journalist, refugee and activist currently based at Justice Connect. So briefly, in terms of the format for today, we'll have these 6 speakers spread across 3 blocks, so 2 speakers at a time. Everyone will give a kind of quick 7 to 8 minute lightning talk, and then there'll be a brief opportunity for speakers in each block to respond to one another. And then at the end of the 3 blocks, we'll also have an opportunity for discussion amongst all of the speakers, and also for questions for those people who are joining in with us live. If you do want to pose a question, the best way to do that is through the chat function on YouTube Live. So if you are watching us through Facebook, for example, and you do want to pose a question, maybe just jump over to the Verso Books Live stream to do that. So we're going to begin then with our first block, which is focused on themes of international labour and solidarity. I'm going to hand over to Manoj, and we'll have about 7 to 8 minutes.
Great. So a big thank you to Tori and David for assembling this global panel of speakers and for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And a big thank you to everyone that's watching and following along. It's good to have you here. So for me, at least, I think what the pandemic's done is it's thrown into sharp relief many of the problems that we have with the way that we organize work in our societies. And for labor activists and scholars who have been trying to raise some of these issues for a while now, it's been quite gratifying to see the kind of public airtime that these issues have received. But I think what's been very noticeable about this discussion is the way in which the scope of the conversation has been circumscribed by borders, and our imagination of the possibilities really limited by the category of the nation state. So briefly, let me give you just 2 examples which I think illustrate this point well. So the lockdowns that have been ordered have directly impacted on the ability of people to earn a living for themselves and their families. But what we don't hear about very often is how this has affected consumer demand for goods which are manufactured and assembled overseas, and the impact that this has on those workers living overseas. Even the solutions that I think we consider are more often than not contained within the nation state imaginary. We speak of governments taking responsibility for the private sector wage bills of citizen workers. But this reinvigorated 21st century welfare state risks replicating many of the exclusions of earlier eras. So I want to suggest that the pandemic makes clear the necessity for a global perspective on work. And I think a global perspective on work has 2 very clear dimensions. First, we need to recognize that after years and decades of immigration, many of the advanced industrial economies have become extremely dependent on migrant workers. They're a key facet of our communities. And second, we need to understand that the interconnected nature of our economy means that most of the goods that we consume have been made by people living all over the world. This means, for me at least, that the work that's done outside our borders is just as essential as the work done within. So let me go into a little bit of detail about each of these groups and the impact that I think the pandemic's had. The proportion of the labor force that migrants make up in the advanced industrial world, it's somewhere between 15 to 25%. And in some of the Gulf countries, it goes up to about 40%. And I think the figure is higher in particular Gulf states. So, but these workers are not evenly distributed in the labor market, right? They tend to cluster in low-wage sectors which engage workers on a range of precarious arrangements. And these workers are working in these countries under a range of different immigration statuses. Some have the right to reside and live permanently and work. Others are present as guest workers, and some lack the proper authorization altogether. The nature of the work performed by many of these migrant workers means that they don't have the option of working from home. They have to leave their homes to trudge off to workplaces, putting their lives and those close to them at risk every day. Now, states have responded to the dependence of these migrant workers in one of two ways. Where their labor has been deemed essential, states have found ways to keep their borders open for these migrant workers. And this is despite many countries closing their borders due to the risk of the COVID. And we've seen this particularly, I think, with seasonal agricultural workers, where exceptions have been made to allow these workers to still migrate. But for those workers whose labor have been deemed to be surplus, states have moved really fast to deport these workers. I think the clearest two examples of this are Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which have been repatriating thousands of workers back to their home countries with little regard for whether this could be transmitting COVID to countries that are not in a good position to deal with its spread. So as well as migrant workers, the pandemic threatened the job of those workers who are employed in global value chains. And some estimates put the figure of the world's population that are engaged in global value chains at somewhere between 450 to sort of 900 million people, right? And we know that most of the goods that we consume today have been manufactured and assembled in these complex chains that crisscross the globe. And lead firms based in rich countries still coordinate the whole production process and still ensure that they manage to capture the majority of the value that's created. As consumer demand has dropped as a result of the pandemic and transportation become more difficult, a lot of factories have shuttered down. You may have heard about the 1.2 or so million Bangladeshi apparel workers who have been furloughed as a result of the pandemic, and of course with no pay or welfare support to aid them. So you can see that to have a more fulsome discussion about the impact of COVID on work, we need to start by considering the broader group of workers than merely citizen workers that live within our borders. So what might some of the long-term impacts of the pandemic be? It's obviously really difficult to make these sort of predictions, but I think one thing that we'll start to see happen in the medium to long term is the shortening of value chains. The pandemic, I think, has highlighted that our methods of production do not leave a lot of room for slack, such as pandemics. This could result in companies deciding to reshore production back home, or at the very least, regionalizing production. And I think some of this reconfiguration of value chains was already occurring before the pandemic because of the trade war between the United States and China, but we're likely to see an acceleration of some of these processes. And I want to suggest that some of these changes could create opportunities for forms of cross-border labor solidarity. I want to tell you quickly about an example in the United States that some of you, especially joining from the States, might know about. So in 2016, a farm worker organization consisting of Indigenous Mexican farm workers called Familias Unidas por la Justicia, or FUJ for short, negotiated a groundbreaking collective agreement with Sakuma Brothers Farms, a multi-million-dollar berry farmer in Washington state. So the farm workers tried to engage directly with the growers to get a collective agreement, often resorting to wildcat strikes. When these tactics didn't work, they called a boycott of Sakuma farms, but that also came into all sorts of practical difficulties. Now, by tracing the berry value chain, the FUJ was able to determine that Sakuma sold most of its berries to a multinational distributor called Driscoll's, which packages, stores, and distributes these berries worldwide. So the FUJ decided to get Driscoll's involved in the dispute. It did this in one of two ways. First, it organized with social movement allies to institute a boycott. And second, it worked with farm workers at another Driscoll's supplier in San Quintin, Mexico, called Berrymex, to take coordinated strike action. This coordinated strike action was possible because most of the farm workers in Baja, California, are also Indigenous Triqui and Mixtec speakers from Oaxaca, like the members of the FUJ. So to cut a long story short, Driscoll's intervened in the labor dispute and pressured Sakuma to settle with the workers. The result was a labor contract, which fairly comprehensively regulates the employment relationship. So I want to leave by saying that the key insight I think to draw from this case is that workers can organize along global supply chains. And rather than their migrant status being an impediment, it can prove to be an advantage in fostering the sort of solidarities necessary for cross-border action. The shortening of value chains that might result from the pandemic might make these sort of actions easier. Because we can think that it's probably a lot simpler to coordinate action across relatively short distances, like the distance between Mexico and the United States, than it is to coordinate action with workers situated on the opposite side of the world. So just to wrap up, I think I want to leave people with the following thought, that the pandemic is going to no doubt alter the structure of our global economy and the way in which we organize work. And some of this will have very troubling consequences, no doubt. But it also might just create the opportunities that we need for a better world. So thank you.
Manoj, thank you so much. I think that's such a powerful and productive way to begin this conversation for all of us. And I think there are going to be really strong and interesting ties to what we're going to hear next from San Marti. So I'll pass over then to San Marti Verma, a lawyer and organiser with the United Workers Union and Undocumented Migrant Solidarity.
Thanks very much, Tori. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm speaking to you from a car parked, outside where I usually live. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Boon Wurrung people. I want to acknowledge today the primacy of First Nations struggle and a lot of what I'm about to speak about in terms of Australia's history of confinement, curtailment, quarantine, population control methods were developed by Australia in the early colonial times in a manner that was directed at First Nations people. So these strategies are merely a refinement of what followed much earlier before. And in speaking about Australia's bordering techniques, we must speak from a particular location. So what I'd like to share with you today are a few thoughts on how that management has evolved over the past few months and what opening it may allow for organising, particularly with the unrecognised population of undocumented people in Australia. But before I turn to that, perhaps a disclaimer of the position from which I speak. I'm not an academic, I'm a lawyer. I organise with migrant workers on sort of the outskirts of the Australian union movement, which has had a long history of not engaging with migrant workers and adopting an aggressively protectionist stance. But necessarily because of that positionality and because of my absence of direct experience of what I'm speaking about, my views are necessarily going to be blinkered. So with that in mind, let me share with you what I've seen and what I've noticed. So in February this year, when tens of thousands of Chinese people living in Australia had returned to visit family in China for the new year, the current Conservative government in Australia announced the bizarre first line of defence against COVID-19. What the government proposed was to impose a selective travel ban, and subject to that, the temporary visa holders would be barred from re-entry. But bizarrely, Australian citizens and permanent residents of Chinese descent would be allowed back into the country, but subject to a period of internment at an immigration detention centre off the west coast of Australia on Christmas Island. Families kept in the centre were asked, even more dramatically, to sign a health waiver, presumably so that the government could not be held responsible for any complications that resulted from holding people in detention conditions thousands of kilometres away from equipped medical facilities. The same technique of border control, bizarrely distinguishing Australian permanent residents and citizens on the one hand and temporary migrants on the other, has persisted throughout the crisis despite its open absurdity. Even on its own terms and its complete lack of sort of social and epidemiological basis should be self-evidently clear. Why would a Chinese international student pose a greater risk to public health than a Chinese-born permanent resident? This approach draws on Australia's long history of containment, quarantine and bordering as forms of risk management, with detention as its central feature. Immigration detention, which since 1992 has been mandatory for those without valid visas, in fact started as a form of quarantine. Detention centres were, in the 90s, remade from the old reception centres, where migrants would be held for initial health screening before they were housed in the community. That's probably all I'll say about Australia's detention environment, because I'm sure Rouge has much more interesting things to say about that topic. I suppose my point is that the selectivity of Australia's migration program is its central feature and has become a matter of international note. So over the past year, both Canada and the UK have gestured favourably towards Australia's highly selective points-based migration scheme, according to which potential migrants are sort of disaggregated into their individual qualities, age, education, work experience and so forth, and awarded sort of a technocratic number of points for each of those particular categories. So because of the robustness of Australia's border control mechanisms and its universal use of mandatory detention, there's been little to no awareness that there is the presence of a long-term community of undocumented migrants in Australia. This fact is something that has been changed by the crisis, specifically because of the reformulation of people's approach to the labour market or people's view of the labour market that Manoj has suggested in his introduction. So in its initial phase, the crisis sorted the labour market starkly into so-called essential and non-essential workers. When examined closely, it turned out in Australia that the essential sectors, so farm work, transport, commercial cleaning, aged care and so forth, were all dominated either by temporary or undocumented workers. The reliance of these sectors on these workers, and undocumented people in particular, suddenly became inescapable. So who are undocumented migrants in Australia? What I've said about the selectivity of Australia's migration program, and of course Australia's unique geography, whereby the entire thing is just an island or an archipelago, depending on how you look at it, the absence of land borders and so forth, means that undocumented migrants must be made. That is, that people must first arrive with lawful status in order to have it stripped from them. So in that sense, like elsewhere, undocumented status needs to be understood as a creation of the law, which both bestows status and then takes it away. So from what we've observed with our organising through the United Workers Union, the population of undocumented workers in Australia is sort of formed by a series of sedimentary layers of people left behind in various eras of punitive migration reform, basically speaking. The most recent layer is comprised of mostly Malaysian nationals who over the past 10 years have had access to visa-free travel arrangements to Australia. Those travel arrangements have dovetailed with sort of predatory labour migration schemes that are formulated by agents based in Australia operating with agents based in Malaysia to basically import people for the purpose of doing farm work. Once people arrive, their migration status is taken into the hands of their employers, who then control the rest of their journey and control when they are in status and when they are without status. Other than those folks, also a significant portion of Australia's undocumented population is comprised of refugees, people seeking asylum who have arrived by boat, and because of Australia's kind of pioneering advances, legal advances in that field, have been deprived of the ability to regularise their status without the personal intervention of the Minister for Immigration. So people sort of float unlawfully in the community until such a time as the Minister for Immigration is willing to intervene personally in their case. Other than those, there are Pacific Island workers who I'm sure Tori will address, who have arrived on seasonal work visas or have had family here for a very long time and have simply overstayed those visas. And then lastly, there's a sizable population of mostly Indian and Chinese former international students who were drastically affected by the changes to the skilled migration program that Australia brought into effect from 2009 onwards, but who by that time had profound connections to Australia and had invested tens of thousands of dollars in trying to seek a future here. So rather than returning home, of course, just slipped into the community and became undocumented in their status. So in March 2020, as Manoj has sort of, through the processes that Manoj has flagged, where economies really had to face the centrality of migrant labour to the way that their supply chains, their value chains function. So in March 2020, when faced with the reality that thousands of Pacific farm workers would have to be returned home with no seasonal workforce available to replace them, the government in fact created all of a sudden an emergency new class of visa that people could transition onto, even if their last visa had expired, so even if they were undocumented. In some ways, this was a favourable development in that it was much more permissive as a visa class than the seasonal work visas that people had held. But of course, it tied people to continuing work in these so-called emergency fields. So in fields that are typically unorganised, ununionised, high risk, frontline, and drastically underpaid. By the same token, over the past few months, peak farming bodies have dramatically begun to openly back the idea of a public amnesty for undocumented workers, which in turn would return some 60 to 100,000 people to legal status in Australia if it were granted. This would be one of the few amnesties in Australian history, the last one being under the Hawke government, which was extended to Chinese students after the Tiananmen Square massacre. So, of course, this is a big deal to have industry bodies joining with calls made by one fragment of Australia's union movement for the past few years and acknowledging that Australian farms would cease to operate were it not for the labour of undocumented people. This is a transformative thing. It's 3 or 4 years, or half a decade of progress that's been made over the course of 2 or 3 months of pandemic. So of course this is something that's welcomed, and of course people ought to be returned to status and not falter without status in the community. But what are the pitfalls of an amnesty granted in these terms? What are the pitfalls of a solution granted for workers on the basis of their economic utility, based on arguments about essential work and so forth? In this sense, Australia has the example of Italy before it. There, just recently, tens of thousands of undocumented migrants were regularised, but just weeks later joined in mass protests throughout the country against their conditions, holding up signs that said things like, "This is an amnesty for tomatoes and not humans." And then we have the examples in front of us of labour reforms that have been brought in various countries to do with frontline health workers. And again, workers have responded by saying, we're not essential, we're sacrificial, that minor changes in our conditions are not going to change the overall structural position that we occupy within the economy. So how is it that amnesty solutions and migration solutions enacted in this sort of piecemeal way are still designed for the very purpose of subjugating people's labour and rerouting migrant populations, even those deemed non-essential, really into doing essential work with pay and conditions that may be questionable because of decades of operating unorganised. So these are the type of questions that come up, that while states are moving very, very quickly to enact migration-related reforms, on what terms are they taking place, and on what ideologies are they predicated?
All right, San Martin, thank you so much for that. A really fascinating and really productive intersections there between both of your presentations. We've got a couple of minutes now to open up for both of you to respond to each other's talks. Manoj, did you want to jump in response to anything that came up there from San Martin?
Yeah, I found St. Martin's comments really interesting, actually, and some of the detail that she provided about what was going on in Australia was quite fascinating, because, of course, Australia has always really been played this very interesting role as a state, right? It's been at the vanguard of introducing quite a horrible number of reforms, which have then been taken up by a number of other state actors, and obviously its treatment of asylum seekers. It stands out in its mistreatment of asylum seekers, and that sort of action's been copied right around the world. But I've been living in the UK recently, and we've been having a very challenging, let's say, conversation about immigration reform. And the role that the Australian points-based immigration system has played in the public rhetoric's been just truly fascinating, right? Like, the Conservative Party went to the elections with the promise of introducing an Australian points-based system, and the system that they've started, well, the bill is actually just wending its way through Parliament now, looks nothing like the Australian system. Because it's essentially an extended temporary visa program where you need to have a job offer, and then at the end of that 5-year process, you can apply for settlement and then citizenship down the track. But it's an employer-tied visa, right? But it's been sold on the basis that it is a replica of the Australian points-based system. So I think that's interesting in terms of the kind of the valuing, I think, Sen Marty, you were talking about, of humans on the basis of their need for the economy, how entrenched that rhetoric has really become around the world, right? Because I think that's exactly how the UK conceives of immigration.
Sen Marty, did you want to jump in briefly?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, there's always the stultified pause on Zoom. Yeah, look, I think Australia, I don't know, look, I'm speaking from this place, so it always seems, at the very forefront of immigration-related brutality to me. But I guess the kind of innovation of Australia's immigration system is sort of twofold. On the one hand, it's succeeded at creating an unending series of temporary statuses that transition to nowhere, that unashamedly do not lead to permanent residence. And the other genius of Australia's migration program is this ability to tie people directly to their employers in order to have any hope of permanent migration. So in other words, Australia specialises in extracting the maximum level of utility out of migrant workers that is humanly possible. And regimes that are predicated upon, you know, as I've said, Australia sort of has to create its undocumented population in situ. You know, advanced sort of neoliberal economies require undocumented labourers. You can't run an advanced economy without having people who are completely deprived of legal status. But Australia must create them. And the way that that happens is, you know, at the end of these temporary to temporary processes when people can't transition to anything. And so, you know, Nicholas de Geneva writes really brilliantly about this type of phenomenon that, you know, on the one hand, we have these economies that speak about, you know, speak in terms of bordering and exclusion and so forth. But really all that rhetoric is intended to do is not to border countries as such, but to mark people who remain, or to mark migrants who remain, with a type of irregularity or a type of subjugated status that's apt for the subjugation then of their labour. So I think this is a really interesting sort of phenomenon that, you know, countries are going to, as the you know, crisis sort of abates, countries are going to start talking this talk about deporting and removing and so forth. But Australia's, for instance, despite all of its talk, it's got a huge appetite to detain people, but it doesn't have a huge appetite to deport people. It does selectively, you know, in sort of really stark cases of, you know, asylum seekers and refugee families, and these practices that it has of, you know, interception and return on the high seas. But it doesn't have this broad appetite to round people up in the community and then just send them in their tens of thousands back to their home countries, because of course people are performing crucial economic functions by that stage. So this is sort of something that we need to watch, like a rise in, you know, sort of bordered or exclusionary or essentially alt-right type language within our economies that's actually just intended for the purpose of continuing to subjugate migrant workers who inevitably will remain after the crisis, with status or without.
It's hard. I mean, we are designing these immigration systems with sort of growing complexity, and there's kind of a variety of just different precarious statuses that you can fall in and out of. And one has to question. It's hard to avoid the confusion, really. What is this complexity designed to do? Essentially, it's disciplining. It has a disciplining role, right? I think.
All right, thank you both so much. In some ways, thank you in selfish ways, because you've so, you know, kind of powerfully set up a set of themes and considerations that I think my own work also will kind of build on now. And what I'd like to do, I guess, is in the next few minutes, really build on what both of you have both highlighted, particularly in terms of thinking around the lived experiences of farm workers in Australia, and the ways that these are being pronounced and articulated in this context of current crisis. And what I'd like to do and to think about with everyone here, I guess the kinds of bordering politics and practices and histories, particularly, that these experiences speak to, and the ways in which kind of nations, including colonial nations, are being produced and reproduced in the present. So I'm an anthropologist, and a large focus of my research is on labour and race relations in the context of the Australian horticultural industry. And I also research and write about relationships between Australia and the Pacific. And these two bodies of work come together in important ways. So the place where my farming research is focused is a place called Shepparton, which is about 2 hours north of Melbourne, where I am now. It's a fruit growing region, growing apples and pears in particular, both of which are really labour intensive crops. And the fruit growing industry there dates back to the mid to late 1800s. So it began with the discovery by white settlers of fertile river flats in 1838. followed by the arrival of squatters and then surveyors who kind of induced so-called men of means to settle in the 1850s through to the 1870s. This was followed by the development of an irrigation system in the early 20th century, and this establishment of a network of canals across the landscape was really what enabled the growth of the horticultural industry there. So this was, as was the case with the development of agricultural industries across Australia, a process of frontier colonialism, of dispossession, in this instance of the Indigenous Yorta people whose sovereignty over this country in the area around Shepparton extends over tens of thousands of years. And it was also, of course, the process of bordering, of mobilities and immobilities, both forced and voluntary, a process of clearance of Indigenous people and of the land itself, of fencing, surveying, valuing and making parcels of land into property to be bought and sold, the carving of these irrigation channels, the planting of rows and blocks of fruit trees, which were bordered by streets that today still bear the names of those early orchardists. And it was through these processes as well that we start to see the making of the Australian nation. And so we have the situation where farming, like pastoralism, became a really foundational part of the Australian national narrative. And the figure of the farmer as this kind of stoic, rugged pioneer, transforming an environment imagined as harsh and unforgiving. And this is absolutely a racialised and a colonial narrative, and it's one that makes land and places and nations as sites of belonging for some people and authorises the dispossession and the exclusion of others. And there's another history too that's particularly relevant in thinking about the colonial formation of agriculture in Australia, and that is the 19th century Pacific labour trade, which saw 60,000 odd Pacific men, women and children blackbirded or brought to Australia under conditions that were often coerced and always deeply exploitative to work the sugarcane plantations of northeastern Australia. This was Melanesian labour, black labour, used at a time when such work was deemed unsuited for white people. And the use of this labour continued up until Australia's federation in 1901 and the inauguration of the White Australia policy, which saw the deportation of large numbers of Pacific Islanders who had been brought to Australia through this migratory scheme. So I want to jump from that history and come back to the present moment and think about the ways that those histories are being articulated now in the present and in this context of COVID. So the early days of the pandemic were, as everyone knows, characterised by these runs on supermarket shelves, panic buying, and so on. And there's something very essential, I think existential even, about the centrality of food in our response to the crisis. And I don't think it's a coincidence that issues around food and food supply and food labour have been really central themes throughout this teaching. So this kind of rush to the basics of survival in a context where life and survival itself are threatened. And in the middle of this run on food and faced with supermarket shelves emptied of pasta and flour and other foodstuffs, there was this rush from farmers in Australia, from the farming industry and from government to assert this national self-sufficiency over the food supply system. So the Federal Minister for Agriculture and the National Farmers Federation rushing to assure the public that Australia's food supply chains were secure, that, as they put it, don't worry, we produce 85% of the food we consume within our own borders. There's nothing to worry about. But of course, that idea of national self-sufficiency in food production is absolutely false, in large part because it obscures the absolute reliance of the Australian horticultural industry on migrant workers, exactly as San Marti was laying out for us before, backpackers, international students, refugees and asylum seekers, other temporary migrant workers, as well as undocumented workers. And a large and growing proportion of this workforce are, in this kind of echo of the past, Pacific Islanders. So in the region where I work, in Shepparton, there's a resident community of Pacific Islanders, Samoan and Tongan in particular, who've lived in the area and worked in that industry for over 30 years in ways that are really largely unrecognised. And then since 2008, Australia has also had this specific temporary migration scheme focused on bringing Pacific Islanders to Australia for 6 months at a time to work, particularly in harvest labour. Now, it's not that, I don't want to suggest that farmers themselves don't work. My work also involves working with farmers themselves, and farming labour is hard, it's tough, particularly within horticulture. But I guess the questions I want to raise here are around whose labour produces what and for whom. Who is credited with feeding the nation? Who gets to claim belonging and the rights that that endows by virtue of their labour, and who doesn't? Who gets the credit and who gets to claim belonging is, of course, this figure, which has always gotten the credit, has always claimed belonging over this land and space. This figure of the farmer, this reassertion, re-amplification of the stoic, hardworking, white Australian farmer as the person who feeds the nation. And so these kind of variegated rights and entitlements that San Marti was talking about are also being evidenced in really stark ways in the massive rollout of welfare responses to the pandemic as well. So this massive wage subsidy scheme, for example, which is denied to migrant workers, to undocumented workers. And I guess I'll kind of close by thinking a little bit about maybe some of the possibilities that come out of this state of deep inequality and really intense racialisation. I've been really struck by the kinds of political organising that have been going on in response to this, and really struck particularly by the rallying cry of so many farm workers under this slogan of "We feed you," which I think has become this really kind of profound statement of political assertion and presence, and perhaps also political possibility in speaking back to what are really long-standing and deeply rooted racialised histories in this place. So I'm going to wrap that up there, and Teresa, I'm going to hand over to you now. So Teresa Mayers is an anthropologist at the University of Vermont.
Great, thank you, Tori. So thanks everyone that's watching from home, and I've learned so much already from the people who've spoken before me. And I think that Manoj's point about, that the pandemic has done nothing more really than bring into sharp relief some of the inequalities that we see, whether it's racial inequalities, whether it's labor-based inequalities. Of course, those are connected. But I think, naturally, I think we see how conversations about food, whether it's conversations about labor and food or about the shortages of food, are so completely part of the conversations around the pandemic. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that and situate it within a place that I'm both living and working, which is the state of Vermont. And it's a state that has certainly earned a certain reputation of being this sort of idyllic, beautiful Bernie Sanders kind of utopia, which there's definitely some truth to that. But my work here has focused on the ways in which migrant workers access food or don't access food, and the ways that they experience the lack of access to basic needs, even as they're contributing to the food security of not only our state, but our broader region. So a lot of connections to what we've already been talking about. But before I get into that, I think it's really, what I wanted to start out with is this point that I think has been made really well, but I want to kind of emphasize it, which is the fact that borders are not just these sort of discrete, geophysical places. And I think in all of the talks that we've already heard, we are getting a sense of that borders are as much a process as they are a place, right? Whether it is about limiting who is belonging, limiting who is accepted, limiting, as Tori is talking about, who gets to claim credit for the work that we see in the food system. I think borders are, or bordering is a really helpful way of thinking about, again, that process of exclusion and inclusion. So hopefully we can come back to that. So I'm in the state of Vermont, which recently I wrote a book called Life on the Other Border. And we often don't think about the northern states in the United States as border states. And I think that there's some good reason for that, I'm not at all going to claim that the kinds of violence or the kinds of inequalities that we see on the US-Mexico border are exactly the same up here. But I think that there's ways in which we might think about what is the experience of living in borderlands that might be, might help us better understand those processes of bordering. So we're a very rural state. Vermont is a very rural state. We're actually faring fairly well with the pandemic because there's not a lot of people here. We're alternating between the lowest rate of infection, or the speed of infection, and the second lowest. So we're doing pretty well here. But we're also a state that has, I think, a lot of unseen inequalities. And through the ethnographic work that I've done here, I've hopefully borne witness and am sharing some of that here and in the teaching that I do. So most of my work has focused on the dairy industry, which is a really key industry here in Vermont. We're the most dependent state on one agricultural commodity in the United States, and that commodity is milk here. And it's, part and parcel of the representation of the state. There's the kind of joke that there's more cows than people here, which is actually not the case. But it's a really important commodity for not only the state's identity, but also the state's viability. Since the pandemic started, though, we have seen a deepening of the dairy crisis here in Vermont, with farmers now dumping milk because they cannot sell it at the cost of production. They long have sold it for very, very low prices. But we've seen a tanking of the price for milk here in the state. And it's also a state that has been tremendously dependent upon migrant workers for producing that key commodity. So it's estimated that about 70% of milk in the state is produced on farms that hire workers from outside the United States. And because of the ways, very contradictory ways that agricultural visas are set up, dairy workers really have no legal pathway into milking cows specifically, because it's year-round work, it's not seasonal work, which is where people often enter through the H-2A visa program. And so dairy workers in Vermont are facing a number of sort of borders, a number of iterations of the borders every day that they're here. They are experiencing the border around the farm where they're often living and working. Vermont is a very homogeneously white state. And so for Indigenous farm workers, often from Chiapas and southern parts of Mexico and some from Guatemala, they're very visible here. And what that means is that being in public means that they're often subject to policing. They're subject to detention and deportation at rates that are much higher, than we might see in other either more urban places or places further away from the border. They're also mostly men, and they are living and working on these farms, crossing the border through communications with their families back home, often grappling with the trauma of crossing the US-Mexico border still. And then they're living in this border zone with Canada, where the farms are constantly being passed by Border Patrol, and that leads to a lot of fear and anxiety. So what the pandemic has done is, as I think Manoj just said, is it's bringing a lot of these inequalities into really sharp relief. So, the inequalities and the challenges that farm workers have experienced have become more pressing as it's even more risky to be in public, as it's even more risky to be around other people. There's a lot of overcrowding in these farms as well. And so the possibility of social distancing on the farm is pretty much negligible. You can't get away from your coworkers because they're often also living with you. And the challenges that we see in the meatpacking facilities, while I think are probably more amplified than what we're seeing here, are also ways that the sort of existing vulnerabilities and structural violence that farm workers are experiencing are really being exacerbated. But not as all doom and gloom. And I think One of the things that I've seen while working here in Vermont is that even as farm workers are being repressed, even as farm workers are experiencing a number of sort of very violent realities, there's also been this unprecedented, exciting farm worker organizing that has taken place, and that has largely been focused on a program called Milk with Dignity, which is a campaign that was developed and organized by an organization called Migrant Justice. This organization is drawing upon the model of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a worker-driven social responsibility model, unlike corporate social responsibility, to really reshape working conditions to meet farm worker priorities. And that campaign and that program is still running. It's, of course, those farms have been impacted by the pandemic. But I think what's interesting is that in these places like Vermont, which is a very peculiar place, this peculiar borderland, we're seeing both the starkest inequalities connected with migration and borders, and also, to me, some of the most exciting possibilities. And really, all of the connections between what's happening with Familias Unidas or the CIW, or what we're seeing with some recent organizing work within meatpacking workers is happening here as well. And so, like Tori, I'm an ethnographer, and I wanted to just speak to sort of the place where I'm working and the context that I'm working. I love that, I got to be represented, and the work was represented among all of these amazing activists and scholars. But I think that nothing else, is important other than, this pandemic is pressing, it's challenging, but it's impacting people differently. And it's also illuminating how we might learn from people who have been marginalized and who have been stuck in their homes for far too long. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much, Teresa. There's so much there that really resonated with my own experience and understandings, and I think what we've heard from others this morning, evening, wherever you are so far. And I'm really struck by that description of kind of bordering as this series of kind of multiple and intersecting processes that take place across these kind of nested scales, right? Like from the very immediate borderings of containment within, kind of farmhouses, farm properties, places, and then through to kind of national and regional scales. And this idea of, the kind of the political possibilities is really interesting to me. And I wonder if maybe one point of difference between the context that we're talking around is on this kind of theme of visibility. So in the areas where I work in Australia, non-white workers are, in many ways racialized and visible by in their kind of presence in place. But I think sometimes Australia differs from the US and Canada in some ways, in that undocumented workers, I think the reliance on temporary migrant workers has not been generally as visible within kind of public discourse as I think it necessarily has been in the US. And San Marty might, have thoughts on and comments on this later on as well. But one thing that's really been interesting to me, and I think potentially really, kind of quite productive, has been the increased awareness of and visibility of the presence and the reliance on temporary migrant workers in the food supply system in Australia. And that's been building, I think, over a few years, but I think the pandemic has really amplified that and highlighted that. And the fact that we do have, this kind of building campaigning around undocumented workers, for example, in Australia, in a place where I think many Australians would have had just absolutely no consciousness of there even being undocumented workers in Australia, because we think of this, ourselves as this kind of isolated island nation. And so in some ways, I think that visibility brings risks, but also brings political possibilities in terms of kind of the valuing of what these people do, but also simply the presence of these people in the polity. And it opens up these spaces for really interesting and important political demands as well.
Yeah, I think that discussion of visibility is so interesting. And from your talk, I really picked up on that really important question of, whose labor is seen, whose labor counts, who gets the credit for this work. And I think that, maybe I'm sort of in my own small bubble of people who think about this a lot, but I do think that the pandemic has, revealed and shown a really important light on those workers who are absolutely essential to our food system. Although I think, as Samati also described them as being sacrificial, right? That they're both essential to the work that must be done, but they are also sacrificial. And in a recent piece, Seth Holmes describes being down in Immokalee and doing some work there with his physician hat on, of course, with his anthropological sensibilities. And in the test, the COVID test that he was performing, it was something like 50% of farm workers that were being tested were positive for COVID. And so, I think it's such an interesting moment where a lot of things become visible. And then what we do about them, right? What do we do about the inequalities that we're seeing? What are we doing about the violence that we're seeing? As in the United States, we still have a president who is very, very violently and visibly and not so intelligently very anti-immigrant, right? So we'll see how things shake out here in the next few months, but I do think that idea of visibility is such an important one in this conversation. I'm really glad that you brought it up.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to move on now to our third block of speakers for this session. So it's my pleasure to introduce again Marumora Villalpando, an undocumented migrant fighting detention in the United States, the founder of Latino Advocacy, and an organizer with La Resistencia. So Maru, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon from Seattle, Washington. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad that we get to be the last block because we get to hear all these different experiences. And, it's funny as member of the undocumented community to hear how you all talk about us and then see, okay, they're right on. And I never meant to present in any way that I'm the representative of the undocumented community, not even here in the US at all. But I do work not only as an undocumented immigrant publicly, but I work with people currently detained here in Washington State, in Tacoma, Washington. We have one of over 200 detention centers. This one is one of the largest, but not the largest. We have several detention centers in the US, and they go from our contract with a county jail to all the way huge buildings, facilities that can house over 2,000 people. This one right here has a capacity of 1,575, but that doesn't mean that's the maximum. We recently learned that actually the real capacity is 1,975. So that's close to 2,000 people, which we didn't know. I think I like to start by reminding everyone that this detention machine didn't start with Trump. It actually, it is quite recent. In 2003, this huge machine was built under the George Bush president mandate, and it was really a good excuse to privatize something that it wasn't private. We in the US have had la migras, we call it, immigration enforcement, but we didn't have this massive roundup of our communities and deportations because it wasn't privatized. In the US, we have the largest number of people in prisons, we have the largest number of people detained, and we have the largest number of private detentions, although it's not exclusive to the US. But what we believe is that it's not only new and it could go back either to what it was, but we can also undo it completely. And the way we go about it is that we follow the leadership of those detained. So we've been working with people in detention here in Tacoma, Washington, and across the nation. We have become experts in supporting hunger strikes. So the detention machine serves several purposes. You all have heard right now about labor. Labor doesn't go away when you get detained. You also become another piece of labor market in detention, not only as a good, all of a sudden you become a good within detention because myself, although undocumented, that I pay taxes, I end up paying taxes to the corporation that runs this detention center here in Tacoma, Geo Group, that actually runs detention centers in Australia as well, in other places in the world. So I end up paying all that much money to have my brothers and sisters detained. And then all of them end up working also for the detention system. So in many years of hunger strikes throughout the history of our work with people detained, we have also seen work stoppages, which, by the way, are prohibited inside the detention center. So it is a profitable business. And it is profitable not only in the sense of money, but also in the moral sense, because Obama himself let the machine grow. You know, it was under Obama that we saw first the family detention centers. So when people got outraged by the Trump administration separating mothers from their children or parents from their children, they really didn't pay attention when Obama started these huge family detention centers in the first place. So what we have is a very well-run machine that permits the idea that all we need is reform. And so for many years under democratic governments, we heard about immigration reform, which really means how do we keep making money of people either working or not working and then their way out, because they see us as disposable, either on the way coming here because we're forced to migrate, then we arrive here and we're forced to be the cheapest labor available, and then on the way out when they want to get rid of us and also make money. So what we're asking every time is for people to pay attention to the demands of people that go on hunger strike and understand how this localized system really has an impact on everything else and how it has been built from years ago. It's not new, as I said, but it actually comes from the very roots of capitalism and racism. The US relies heavily on criminalizing people of color, especially Black and Latinx people, and obviously stealing the lands of Native people. And so what we see is that the immigration detention system is really an extension of the prison system of the US. And so as such, they work together. The criminalization of our bodies, it has to come in tandem with the penal system, the criminal justice system, and the immigration system, because immigration system in the US is civil, yet is treated as it was criminal, but we're not given the same quote unquote rights that we have in our, in the criminal system, where you have a lawyer if you cannot afford one. And so they definitely match together very well, and they make us believe that all we need is papers. Amnesty, as they call it. Remember, 1986 was the last quote unquote amnesty that really all it did was to criminalize working without a permit. And so we have created, alongside many other states, other organizations, grassroots like ours, to do campaigns to end the detention system. So we have here a shutdown NWDC, because that's the acronym for the detention center here, which is really an abolition work. We don't want only to shut down detention centers or private detention centers. We want to shut down all detention centers and all prisons, because again, they're all combined. They're working in tandem. And so with all the COVID-19 pandemic opening the door, the veils of what people didn't want to see, we push really hard for a campaign called Freedom All, which is we need to get people out of there, not only because it has been horrible, hunger strike after hunger strike, we have seen it, but what we are demanding is now they're in danger and really people could die. So we need to free people immediately. Right now, the rate of acquiring COVID-19 while detaining under ICE custody is more than 50%. That tells you how dangerous the situation is in detention centers. But this is, this conversation is so great because this is not only about the US. We actually join with several other groups in Europe, for example, that are way ahead of us because they probably have less number of people detained. But they, in Spain, for example, they were able to get everybody out of detention. The UK is getting there. We know Italy and Portugal did it. But we're going to the next step. So how do we regularize our status, right? How do we get papers for all? But papers that are not tied to labor. They're not conditioned. And papers that allow us to acquire all the basic needs and basic rights that everybody should have, that have been really the main point of our work here, that we don't want reform, we want change. And so for us, Papers for All is an international campaign, but it's not the end of the campaign. Then we have to move further to an open borders campaign and no borders at all. So we can really talk about, ending with the fact of, that we have migrants here and there, that we're just people that have been forced to migrate, and that we're coming to reclaim what it was taken from us in the first place.
Mari, thank you so much. That's such powerful and important points for all of us to be thinking about, and that call, I think, that demand to move beyond borders, right? That what we need is not this kind of, you know, like polishing of the edge of borders. It's actually borders themselves as a system and structure of power that we need to be contesting through this. And I think you've really set the scene very powerfully for our sixth speaker this morning. So Rouge Ahmedi is a Kurdish Australian journalist, a refugee and an activist, currently based at Justice Connect. So Rouge, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mara. I think your words really permeate the experiences of people in Australia. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the lands in which I'm broadcasting from. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. And I feel like in this historical moment and in my work for racial justice and refugee justice, I can't help but echo what Sanmati was saying, where incarceration of peoples who have been forced to become stateless or being forced to migrate is embedded in a long history of incarceration in the penal colony in Australia. And in this moment where there is a rupture of the movement for global racial justice and combating anti-Blackness and combating the carceral system and police brutality, I think that the message of decarceration and prison abolition echoing even louder than ever before is a wonderful opportunity for refugee justice. What I want to talk about now is that the pandemic has brought this kind of sense of entrapment, oppression, repression, the banality of disconnection and isolation that a lot of refugees and people who've been rendered stateless due to, oftentimes due to external forces and a destruction of sovereignty and warmongering, and have been forced to seek safety in other countries. And that banality, that kind of disconnection, the atomizing of people is very similar to what people experience when they do become stateless. And I think that and what I am worried about is that this invisibilizing, this kind of disconnection will prevent us from having the difficult conversations that we really need to have. In this country, in so-called Australia, we have had movements for refugee justice not led by refugees predominantly, and that we've also been denied the opportunity to build solidarity between people who've been violently persecuted within the migration system. And that there has been very little space to have these conversations because of the fact that we have not been able to build our power, and we don't have the material capacity to voice our concerns. Despite that, though, there have been huge pushes by people with lived experience of incarceration. And I think that this is a really wonderful opportunity. This rupture, this moment of crisis is a real opportunity to start to build those links of solidarity. So what I want to talk about firstly is how did we get to this point, because I think it's incredibly compelling and interesting. While many other countries, such as in North America, have had this conversation about undocumented migrants and temporary workers, in Australia we've had a very silent move to build this underclass of migrant workers and refugees. And so I want to take us back to the early 90s and then leading into the Tampa crisis. The Tampa crisis was a catalyst for Australia's new border protection policy, where we created this kind of permeable concept of our borders despite being an island surrounded by water. It was a pivotal moment and a pivotal issue during the 2001 federal election. What happened was there was a Norwegian boat which had rescued a couple of hundred people seeking safety. They were trying to reach Australia's shores, and the Australian government created and developed this kind of concept of barbarism in these people, and said that they had been throwing their children overboard in a bid to, seek safety or reach the shores of Australia and somehow usurp or jump in the line of migration. And so these people were used as an example and as a distraction while there was huge systemic changes being made in the migration system. And so prior to this, and in between the period of the end of the White Australia policy, which we all have come to deeply despise, but now is coming in its second formation, after the destruction of the White Australia policy and before the Tampa crisis, Australia largely was a permanent migration destination, where essentially if you did come to this country, you would really have like very clear pathways, very efficient and quick pathways of becoming a citizen and being acknowledged as a member of this country. Very quickly after the Tampa crisis, as being used as a catalyst and a distraction, all of this started to change. And so Sanmati did explain elements of this where businesses and corporations were given the power to bring large groups of workers, and suddenly people's bosses in this country were given the right to fire them and deport them. And so we started to develop this underclass of migrant workers that propped up 3 distinct industries: hospitality, education, and of course, food production. And so we had 1.1 million people now that include both temporary workers and undocumented migrants. Up to this point and before the pandemic, it was so difficult to have this conversation about how there was this underclass of migrants that was not only used to create downward pressure on the quality of life in Australia and wage growth, but also that that we were creating this kind of obsession and addiction by big business on these workers. But it was very difficult to have these conversations, and it was very difficult to really bring to light the realities of the Australian economy. I was working with a racial justice movement called Colour Code, and we acknowledged the great work of the United Workers Union, especially in farm workers. But before then, it was a invisibilized experience, and it was very difficult to bring to light that the carceral system that a lot of refugees were experiencing in offshore and onshore detention that many corporations were profiting from was very much the same system that was incarcerating and disconnecting workers and undocumented migrants here in Australia. And so I guess what I want to say is that up to this point and before this rupture, this crisis, we haven't been able to have this conversation. But slowly, despite the destruction and the concentration of media power, of political power, and of organized movements, and that despite the attacks on the union movement, there is a real opportunity to use this rupture to actually put people with lived experience front and center in these movements. And what I'm asking is that ultimately we have 2 opportunities. Firstly is to starve corporations of their resources and to really learn from the prison abolition movement, where every reform that we take in seeking justice for refugees and undocumented migrants needs to be a step towards abolition. And so it is really learning from a broad, a long history of prison abolition and using that as a framework to apply to our movements. I really have learned a lot from Mariam Bakar, who explained that these reforms need to shift policy, and that if we're requesting any type of reform that is supposed to create window dressing or to make light of the violence of the system, will ultimately empower that system. And so we need to move towards that. We also need to move towards creating the circumstances where people have the material opportunity to be engaged politically. And so one of the problems we had was that so many people with lived experience could not even feed themselves day to day, let alone be engaged in that political movement. And so the first step towards justice is to also ensure that people are housed and people have food, and to give that material aid immediately. We need to create the pathways to political engagement, and that's incredibly important. And then obviously, up to this point, our political movements for refugee justice in this country has largely been led by people who are part of the non-for-profit industrial complex that perpetuate the circumstances that a lot of people experience. And what I want to ask is that we tackle this. And despite the leadership shown in so many other different countries, where even the experiences and the work that Maru has been leading, we are several steps behind. And part of us putting people front and center in our movements is to also build those solidarity networks across First Nations communities, people incarcerated in the prison system, and people incarcerated in detention, as well as largely being incarcerated by a migration system that continues to dehumanize them, despite propping up and being essential to the ongoing benefits of this country. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you so much. That was another really powerful contribution for us all to think about. Maru, we have a couple of minutes for you and Rouge to respond to one another. Is there anything that you wanted to jump in with at this point?
I would like to hear more about how would you see accomplices or allies building that space needed for people with experience leading. Here for us, it's not easy, right? Like you mentioned, the nonprofit industrial complex, and all the we have like mainstream organizations that would agree with the Democrats, and they think, okay, we get a Democrat in the White House, everything is solved. And that's really dangerous for us, because it takes us back to normality to them, shitty for us. So I think that like our role as undocumented communities and communities of color is not to teach white people what to do, because that's up to white people to learn. But I do always wonder how accomplices and allies find themselves creating the space that is needed for leadership of those in that have the lived experience. So have you all come to some sort of general idea of how to go about it?
I think the perfect example of this, of the disparity between the people who are decision makers, who are not from these communities, who have built careers off the destitution of people of color, is that essentially there are no resources for self-led initiatives. And so what I want is real material exchange. I remember being at a conference largely presented by people with, refugee and incarcerated experiences. And we were sitting around talking about the need for policy shifts, the need for structural change, all while I knew that the key decision makers who were really grappling with power were in another room, on another phone call, in another state, working together, confronting the refugee system. And this was during some key campaigns that were successful in getting people out of offshore detention. This was the Kids Off Nauru and the medical evacuation campaigns that I was connected to, but I was one of very few people who were connected to those campaigns. So I think that it is about real material exchange, real upskilling, and also the fact that a lot of the initiatives are trying to pinpoint one single figurehead to lead all and to represent all, but we actually need a full community to be uplifted and empowered in real material terms.
So we have some time now to take questions, and I guess to open up these conversations amongst ourselves, but with people who are listening and commenting online. So I've got a question here. First of all, I'll just read this one out. It seems like, if I'm understanding the situation correctly, these migrant workers are granted only temporary allowances to work. Could one liken this to the newly, rising gig economy? And it seems to have been complicated with the pandemic. During these times, people utilised food delivery services as well as those like Amazon and meal kit services. What kinds, if any, of inferences could be made regarding the relationship between the subject and their labour for those in the gig economy? I mean, if I can just comment really quickly from the Australian experience, one of the things that's been really inspiring to me about the work that the United Workers Union have been doing over the past few months is drawing kind of precisely these kind of lines of connection between migrant farm workers, undocumented workers, and casual employees, including, for example, in the hospitality sector. So all of these groups of workers were excluded from this massive wage subsidy welfare initiative that came from our Conservative government, you know, for reasons that I think really speak to the intersecting kind of forms of precarity that are produced both by capital and colonialism, and the ways that that union has been able to bring these workers together to kind of argue in solidarity and fight in solidarity with one another and draw attention to those linkages has, for me, been one of the most kind of exciting political moments here. But I'm going to open it up to others on our panel, if anyone wants to jump in with a reply to that question.
I can say something really quickly. I mean, just in terms of that first part of that question, I think it wouldn't be correct to say that all migrant workers are people here on temporary work visas, right? I think there's always sort of three categories that are useful to think about. Those with the permanent right to remain and work, those with temporary rights to work, often attached, they have employer-type visas or industry-type visas, and undocumented migrants. But that point someone made about the connection with gig workers, I think is absolutely fascinating. In the UK, a lot of gig workers are migrant workers, and a considerable portion are undocumented. And there are good reasons for that, right? It is possible to work in the gig industry as an undocumented worker without fear of being found out necessarily. And then I think that's one of the reasons why migrant work, a variety of different types of migrant workers congregate in the gig economy. And you had some really interesting mobilization. There's been excellent strikes in London, Bristol, and a variety of other cities in the UK around the gig worker sector. And those are essentially undocumented workers who've been at the forefront of those strike actions, I think.
Help if I unmuted myself. Another question here coming in. Could you say more about how racism is experienced in this COVID situation? For example, for migrant labourers from the Middle East who are being left out without care jobs are forced to get back to their country of origin. I'll open that up to anyone from the panel. You know, I think those forces of expulsion have been really powerfully felt, and those who stay and those who are, you know, kind of expelled from the state in this point of crisis seems to be so dependent, often on these really kind of reductive calculations. Value of some migrant workers as, you know, essential workers. There was also this very forceful process of exclusion.
I can add a bit, because here the Latinx community, along with the Black community, has the highest rates of positive COVID-19. And we're seeing with the families of those detained, for example, there's this family whose husband is detained and he has cancer, has not been released, and ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, will do everything and anything to keep him in detention, along with 26,000 other people as of today. And this woman works in the fields in Eastern Washington, and she texted me the other day saying, 2 people end up being positive here. What do I do? And my first thought was, you need to get tested. It turns out that because she's undocumented, she has to pay the $120 to get tested. she doesn't have the money because she recently lost her home. Governor Inslee announced a moratorium on evictions, yet she was evicted from her home. And it's illegal here in the US and in Washington state to deny housing because you have children, yet she ended up on the streets because she couldn't find an apartment because she has 4 children. And so everything that's supposed to be set in place to avoid discrimination, it doesn't apply for people that are undocumented, that are on the fields, that are in rural areas where there's no support, no sense of protection whatsoever. And yet you have a pandemic where you want to get tested, you're undocumented, you have to pay $120 and go to the main hospital, which is really far away. How are you going to do it when you're working all day and you have to pay for childcare at the same time? And she doesn't even have the money for extra gas. So I think it's a very clear example of how even progressive states like Washington state is saying we're ahead of the curve. We're a blue state, as they call it in the US, because it's a democratic state with a democratic majority. Yet we have a family with a clear sense of if she's positive, she's not going to get tested. And if she's not going to get tested, she's not going to get care either.
Mari, that's that's a devastating story. So another question coming in, and feel free, anyone please, to jump in on this one. The fair trade movement has now crossed into the US borders to help migrant workers. Is this a good alternative or a complement to trying to unionize migrant workers? Thoughts there from any of you on the fair trade movement and what that might offer or otherwise in this moment?
I can talk a bit about that. I mean, I think fair trade it's a really interesting idea. It's not a new idea, and it's been in the US for quite some time. And there's even sort of attempts to have domestic fair trade. Fair trade has often been very necessary because of these very long supply chains, but it's been experimented as well with thinking, even about locally produced products. I think, to me, fair trade has a lot of positives, but I think it also comes back to sort of who is defining that fairness. Is it the workers and, through their experiences and through their, the challenges that they faced, or is it companies who are putting that mark on their product? I think one of the things that we see in things like the Fair Food Program or the Milk with Dignity program is that the fairness or what counts as just work is defined by the workers themselves versus companies who are profiting off of that. And so I think fair trade is an exciting idea, and if fully actualized, and if the fairness was really defined by the workers themselves, it would have a lot more promise than it currently does.
I might add a little to that from the sort of fresh food supply chain situation in Australia. So Australia's got just a wealth of laws and regulations and frameworks, basically to ensure basic labour standards and in production chains, particularly in horticulture. There's all sorts of product markings and standards that growers need to sign up to and so forth in order to supply. There's a kind of duopolistic sort of supplier situation in Australia where there's basically 2 major supermarkets that purchase and then supply about 90% of Australia's fresh produce, so Coles and Woolworths. I guess what you see with consumer campaigns or, consumer-based or consumer-driven frameworks around labour regulation is that they create a set of legal strictures that do as much to carve out who lies outside of those strictures, who operates outside of those strictures, and basically to invisibilise those people. So, for instance, there's now labour licensing has come into operation in a number of states in Australia, whereby in order for contractors to supply labour to Australian farmers, must show a license, they must have gone through particular types of checks and so forth. But you talk to farmers on the ground, or you look at the situation on the ground, and farmers continue to use the type of labour that they've always used, the type of labour mix they've always used. And the reason why is, at the end of the day, it's very nice to talk about labour standards and it's very nice to talk about consumer advocacy campaigns. But if the unit price is fixed at a particular amount, then that kind of squeeze on price is always going to be passed down to the person who's at the bottom rung of the supply chain, and that is the worker. And the reality is that, you know, the way that capitalism functions is that the workers are always going to pay. So, you know, Maru's had a lot to say about, you know, migrant-led campaigns not being about reform so much as they are about fundamental change in the way that products are produced and supplied in our economies.
Absolutely. And we had another question here that I think in some ways was covering similar ground around what role consumers can consumers play in highlighting these issues. And I think your answers have already started to touch on that. But happy to open up as well. Are there other things that consumers can be doing, or what other forms of allyship are effective and useful in these contexts where you're all working?
I can just maybe just very quickly touch upon the consumer point that I think, I mean, that's to me, I've spent a bit of time studying the work of an organization that Therese has already just quickly mentioned, which was the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, right? And Migrant Justice, who operate according to sort of a similar model as well. And I think what's interesting is that there's a distinction to be drawn between individual people making ethical consumption choices and the use of a boycott as a social movement tactic. And I think there's a long history of using boycotts as a social movement tactic to apply pressure on particular strategic targets. And I think, depending on the circumstance, it can be an extremely powerful tool, right? And it was very useful in the FUJ example I talked about as well. But I think I'm always very skeptical of people's ability to affect change by making individual ethical consumption choices. Not that we shouldn't if we can afford to do that, but I just don't think that's a tool of social transformation at the end of the day.
Thanks, Manoj. A question here on the language of deservingness. So this has been a theme across these last two teach-ins, and the question here, how has the pandemic affected the way that people are differently marked as deserving or undeserving? Under COVID, what are migrants expected to do to demonstrate their deservingness of protection by the nation?
I would like to, rush. Sorry. I mean, every time people mention the deserving, undeserving, my skin goes like, because, you know, as an immigrant to the US, light-skinned immigrant, there was an expectation that I would assimilate, you know, and if I assimilate, if I learn English, if I even learn English the proper way and do the right accent, not to keep my accent, you know, to dress the proper way, to be thankful that I was given the opportunity to be here. You know, there's this expectation that if we do all those things, then we're going to be accepted. And what we learned, that's BS. That's not true. No matter what we do, we're not going to be accepted. We're just part of this economy and this system that keeps those in power. And by us accepting the situation, it makes it even more difficult to create change, because then we end up protecting the same system that is oppressing us. And so when we take on working with people detained, we're the only organization that comes around and says, let's fight for the release of everyone. And other orgs will say, but what did you do? Why are you in detention? Do you have a criminal record? Are you a good person? What did you do to deserve to be detained? And so we're very clear that we do not fall for the rhetoric of deserving versus undeserving. And this has been throughout the years. And it's not been easy, because a lot of groups do not agree with that, you know, because they're mainstream, because they want to, they've been playing, you know, with DACA here, with the young people. It was like, it was the fault of their parents. It's not their fault. And the politicians use that so much to say, poor kids, let's give them what they deserve. They deserve to be millionaires in the future, which is laughable. But I think that COVID precisely makes that even higher, to the point that, why do I need to ask for the most basic services that any human deserves just so you accept that I need basic healthcare? You know, the fact that all these groups that have been fighting for healthcare for all forget about sometimes people of color or people with no documents. So I think that it's not only about COVID, it's about in general how these systems precisely try to create tiers of deserving of, so we can negotiate each other away. And we're really, really opponents of that, because as abolitionists, when we say we're gonna get everybody out, that's why we also imply the need to shut down also prisons and jails. And so to us, the idea of COVID-19 is, it is a pandemic, it is a time for change, and that change is gonna look the way we want it if we are putting ourselves out there and making sure that change is done our way, because the people in power are already planning changes, and they're already working on changes that are just gonna make it even more difficult for people like us. And by falling for that rhetoric of the deserving versus the underserving, we're just gonna make it easier for them to oppress us even further.
Maru, thanks. Rouge, did you want to add to that point as well?
I want to absolutely agree with everything that Maru said. I think the risk that we often have, especially in Australia, when a majority of people of colour in this country are from upper class communities, even from their country of origin, is kind of perpetuating the veneer of the model minority, and that they can avoid the subjugation, the oppression of racial vilification by, conforming to these standards that Maru explained. But in these moments of crises, in these moments where things can shift so quickly, we need to not fall into the kind of false binaries that we're kind of forced and entrapped into. This is a real moment to redefine something and be incredibly courageous with it. And I think a lot of organizations and movements have kind of put themselves into a corner, backed themselves into a corner, reaffirming and confirming those kind of false dichotomies. And so what has to be in the establishment of anything, of any initiative, is to clearly articulate at the very base, the messages that Mario have kind of has explained, is that you want everyone out, that the dehumanization is not okay, and that we don't want to perpetuate the deserving and undeserving, that the denial of humanity, of freedom, of a shelter, of food, it cannot be perpetuated just because we have created these kind of false ideas of the deserving and undeserving. And so these moments of rupture is really good time to bring those kind of central ethos out and bring it front and center, to redefine the playing field, because the dust will settle. And although we feel like we're in these constant perpetual cycles of crises, the dust will settle, but we want the dust to settle a few steps forward for us, so then we can continue to push.
Right, absolutely. The political goal here is not to create new borders or different axes of detention and division, right? So I'm conscious of time. There's a lot of questions and comments that are coming in on the thread, and I feel like it's such an amazing group of speakers, and we could just keep you here for hours. But also people have lives and days to get on with, and some of you might also have beds to be getting to soon. So I thought I might just bring in one more question that's come through on the thread, because I think it's probably a good one for us to maybe look towards wrapping up with. So the question is, could you tell us any concrete helpful actions that follow the leadership of those detained and can work towards abolition of the detention machine, that we can go away and do? And we might even broaden that question out a little bit more to think about how can we follow the leadership of those who are on the ground as undocumented workers, as farm workers, those who are front and centre in these campaigns.
For us, in order to be truthful to following the leadership of others, I think the first thing is to acknowledge the level of privilege that every person has. Obviously, white people are the dominant culture, but like in my case, I'm not detained. I'm undocumented. I'm also in deportation proceedings, but I'm not detained. And so when people call me, I already hold some power over them because they are detained and they're desperate. And so as we try to work in collaboration with others, we need to understand what privileges we have that they don't. I actually worked with FUJ back in the day, and I never meant to be another farm worker, because that's not my experience. I've never worked the fields. And so I think it's very important to recognize what is your privilege and where you come from and where you don't come from. And are you really listening to what people are telling you? So an example is during hunger strikes, if you read the demands, in many years of supporting hunger strikes here in other states, we have never seen strikers saying, give us free lawyers, which would be great. You know, having a lawyer does improve your chances, but they know that that doesn't solve the problem. They ask for better conditions. They ask for the end of detention, the end of deportations. They see the overall work needed. And when lawyers come out and say, oh, we're going to get, you know, I'm going to fundraise so we can get you free lawyers, did you really listen? Probably not, because this is what happens when you don't listen and you have good intentions, there's bad consequences. So for example, when you bring lawyers, but you never have enough lawyers for everybody, then you have to pick and choose. When you start picking and choosing, then you infringe in the really hard work of creating unity and organizing inside a detention center, because then people say, how come you got a lawyer and I didn't? That is really harmful to organizing inside. You need to listen. You need to pay attention to your privilege. And first of all, don't think that you have the solution. It's very arrogant of those that come around our way and say, have you tried this? Have you talked to this person? Have you talked to this organization? We know what we're doing. And that's the worst thing you can do, is to treat us as we're stupid. We are our own experts. We know what we're doing. What we need is just for you to listen. And that's why my question was in regards to Australia, what is the role of allies? How do you find yourself being a real ally? And that question is on you. So don't put it on us either on what that will look like. We want people ready to do the fight with us, because we don't have time to teach others.
Mara, thank you so much. So in terms of just kind of wrapping up and bringing this, this to a close, I just want to briefly bring in some words here from David Giles, who's really been the driving force throughout this whole series, and I'm so grateful for him for setting up these really rich and powerful conversations. I've learned so much from all of them. And some words here from David. He writes, a pandemic pulls at every thread of our social fabric simultaneously. It places an inexorable hydraulic pressure on our political and economic structures that is transmitted at once to every part of our societies. Everyone I know is doing it tough right now, and in myriad ways. Friends have become homeless as a result of the pandemic. Colleagues have lost their jobs. Participants in this very teaching series have faced the loss of family members to the coronavirus and still insisted on participating. For that reason, we are beyond grateful to everyone who has shared their time with us, both speakers and those in the audiences. But if the pandemic touches us all in so many ways, it also reveals how entangled our lives are. A crisis is also a moment in which brand new forms of political common sense are invented and brand new kinds of solidarity are forged. And so, in spite of its dangers, as Arundhati Roy put it, the pandemic is a portal. To where and how shall we get there? The linkages between all of our various struggles have never been more evident than they are now. To reveal those linkages is certainly the goal of the Relational Poverty Network. And I hope that across all 4 sessions, it has become clearer the ways in which we might stand in solidarity with one another, even across such distances. So I just want to open up very briefly for any closing comments or final thoughts from those who are with us today. If anyone has any last words.
I just want to thank everyone. I've learned so much. What a wonderful way to spend a Friday night in Vermont.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such an interesting connections that have, I think, been made between some really interesting different topics.
I think I have felt very heartened by the fact that we can all agree that putting the worker, putting the person affected by these huge shifts by COVID-19 at the center and at the height of our movements, of our initiatives, is incredibly important. That, you know, ethical consumer choices are not going to save us, and we need to really understand who is defining what fairness and equality is. I think that's the biggest message that I'm hearing loud and clear from everyone, and I feel heartened that we're connected in this way and we're working towards that goal.
Well, I'd just like to echo those thoughts, absolutely, to thank you all. It's been such a privilege to learn from each of you today. And thank you, Sanmati, Maru, thank you also to everyone who's joined us on the live feed. And these videos will all be available as well through Verso's YouTube channel. So please, we hope they'll be a valuable resource for all of us moving forward.